The chapel smelled like lilies and strong coffee, the kind they keep in those big metal urns near the back for people who don't know what to do with their hands. Outside, the January air in Hartford felt sharp enough to sting, but inside it was warm and still, like the building was holding its breath. I stood near the front with my fingers locked together so tight my knuckles went pale, staring at the closed casket and trying to convince myself this was real. My dad would have hated all the fuss. He wasn't a say a prayer and whisper politely kind of person. He was loud in small ways, whistling when he cooked, singing half the words to old songs, laughing at his own jokes. Seeing his name on the program felt wrong, like someone had printed it by mistake. People drifted up to me in waves, neighbors, co-workers, old friends, touching my shoulder, telling me he was a good man, saying, "If you need anything," and then walking away before I could answer. I kept nodding because it was easier than speaking. I hadn't seen most of my father's side of the family in years, and they moved through the room like they owned it. My Aunt Diane, especially, acted like she was hosting a party instead of burying her brother. She wore black like it was a uniform, pearls at her neck, hair sprayed into place, and she kept correcting tiny details, where the flowers should sit, which photo should face the aisle. Every time she looked at me, her eyes slid past like I was a stain on the wall. When the service ended and people started standing up, she didn't wait for the room to clear. She stepped in front of me right there in the aisle, like she'd been saving her energy for this moment. Her voice carried too well in that quiet space. "I just want to make something clear," she said, smiling without warmth. "Some people show up when it's convenient. Some people actually show up when it matters." A couple of heads turned. Someone coughed. I felt the heat rush to my face, but my body stayed frozen, like my brain had pulled the emergency brake. Diane kept going, her tone sweet, like she was offering a helpful tip. "My brother was sick a long time. He needed real support. Not texts. Not occasional calls. And now suddenly we're all supposed to pretend you were here the whole time." I heard my own breathing, shallow and loud to me, while the rest of the room felt far away. I wanted to say, "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what he asked me to do. You don't know the nights I drove out here, the mornings I sat with him when he couldn't sleep." But the words stuck. Not because I didn't have them, because I did. Too many. I just knew that if I opened my mouth, I'd either scream or cry, and Diane would love both. She tilted her head toward the casket, like my dad was a prop in her speech. "He told me himself," she added, louder now. "He wanted things handled properly. He wanted his affairs protected. And since I was the one taking care of him, obviously I'm the one who'll be handling the estate." The way she said estate made it sound like a prize. People were watching openly now. I could see my cousin Brent standing near the doorway, arms crossed, looking like he'd already picked a side. A few of the older relatives murmured to each other. Diane leaned in just enough that only I could hear the edge beneath her calm. "You don't have rights here," she whispered. "Don't embarrass yourself." Then she straightened, addressing the room again like she was announcing the next hymn. "So if anyone has questions, please come to me. We're keeping things respectful and organized." That's what my brother would have wanted. Respectful. The word landed like a slap. I stayed quiet. I let her have the aisle, the attention, the little moment she'd planned. My throat burned, but I swallowed it down. I walked out into the cold air with my hands shaking inside my coat pockets and told myself I wasn't going to fall apart in the parking lot, not here, not in front of her. By the time everyone moved to the side room for the reception, those sad trays of sandwiches and cookies you eat without tasting, I felt hollow, like I'd left my real body back in the pew. Diane floated from group to group, collecting sympathy like tips. I sat near the wall and stared at a paper cup of coffee I didn't drink, listening to people talk around me like I was furniture. That's when Diane slid into the chair next to mine, too close, her perfume cutting through the smell of food. "There's going to be a reading," she said, quietly but with a grin. "Just so we can wrap things up properly. The lawyer will be here any minute." I looked at her. "A reading? Today?" "Of course today." She patted my knee like she was calming a child. "No reason to drag it out. You'll hear it, and then we can all move forward." Move forward. Like my dad was a task on her list. I didn't answer. I watched her stand up, smooth her dress, and walk away like she hadn't just tried to erase me in front of a room full of grieving people. The side room felt too bright after the chapel. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, folding chairs, nothing about it matched what I was feeling. People talked in soft voices, but there was an undercurrent now, like everyone had sensed the tension and didn't want to be the first to touch it. Diane took the spot at the front without anyone offering it. She stood with her hands clasped, looking around like she was counting faces. Every so often she glanced my way, just to make sure I was still sitting there, still quiet, still playing the role she'd written for me. Someone's phone buzzed. Someone laughed a little too loudly at a story about my dad's old pickup truck. It made me want to scream. I kept my eyes down, focusing on small things, the tear in the corner of a paper napkin, a drop of coffee on the tile, because if I looked at the crowd, I'd start reading their expressions and I didn't have the strength. When Diane said I hadn't been there, she made it sound simple. Like life is a straight line and people choose to be present or absent. The truth was messy. My dad and I weren't perfect. We fought. We had long silences. There were years where I lived in another state and tried to build a life that didn't revolve around old family patterns. But my dad never stopped being my dad. And when things got bad, really bad, he didn't call Diane first. He called me. I remembered one night in October, when the leaves had already turned and the air outside my apartment in Providence smelled like damp pavement. My phone rang at almost midnight. Dad's voice was rough, like he'd been pretending not to be scared. "Hey, kid," he said, like that was normal. "You awake?" He didn't talk about money. He didn't talk about houses or paperwork. He asked me how work was going, how my car was running, whether I was still eating enough. He circled around what he really wanted to say until finally he let out a breath and admitted, "I'm tired. I don't think I have much time." I went quiet back then too, but not because I had nothing to say. Because hearing it out loud made it real. I told him I'd drive out in the morning. He told me not to. "Diane's here," he said. "And I don't want a scene. I needed to hear you." After that, we talked more. Not every day, but enough. He told me things he'd never said when I was younger. How he regretted letting people speak over him. How he regretted letting Diane run the family like a small kingdom. He didn't sound angry, just worn down by years of being managed. There was one afternoon I came to Hartford and Diane wasn't home. Dad was sitting in his recliner with a blanket on his knees and a baseball game on mute. He looked smaller than I remembered, and he patted the couch like he wanted me close. We didn't talk much at first. Then he leaned over, reached into the side table, and pulled out an envelope. "Don't open it here," he said. I blinked. "What is it?" "Just, insurance." He gave a tired little smile. "People get weird when there's money, Maya. They get mean. You know that." I didn't open it. Not then. I put it in my bag and drove back with the radio off the whole way, replaying his words. People get weird. People get mean. It sounded like he was warning me about a storm that hadn't hit yet. Now, sitting in that side room with Diane acting like the queen of grief, I understood what he meant. The door opened and a man stepped in with a leather briefcase and a coat that looked too expensive for a funeral home. He was tall, gray at the temples, and he scanned the room with the tired patience of someone who's done this too many times. Behind him, the director of the funeral home nodded politely and slipped back out. "That'll be Mr. Caldwell," Diane said, loud enough for the room to hear. She walked up to him immediately, smiling, hand extended like they were old friends. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." He shook her hand, but his eyes moved past her, taking in the whole group, the way people do when they're measuring a situation. "Of course," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss." Diane angled her body like a shield. "We're ready," she said. "We'd like to proceed." Mr. Caldwell didn't rush. He set the briefcase on a table, opened it, and pulled out a folder with neat tabs. When he looked up again, his gaze met mine for a second. Not friendly, not cold. Just aware. Like he knew I was the person watching the right details. Diane cleared her throat and faced the room. "As I said," she announced, "we'll do this properly. Then we can all go home." I noticed her emphasis on "we," the way she included herself at the center of everything. I also noticed how she didn't look at me once. Someone pulled another chair forward for the lawyer. A few relatives shuffled closer. The room tightened, like everyone leaned in without realizing it. And even though I still hadn't said a word, I felt the first real shift of the day, like the story Diane had been telling was about to meet something solid. Mr. Caldwell opened the folder and adjusted a page with his fingertips. "Richard Collins executed a last will and testament," he began, calm and steady. "I'm going to read it as written." Diane's smile flickered, just for a second, then returned stronger. She looked around the room, confident, almost glowing. Like she'd already won and this was just the trophy ceremony. I kept my hands in my lap and reminded myself to breathe. My dad's warning echoed again, "People get mean." And here we were. Mr. Caldwell's voice had that practiced neutrality lawyers use when they're delivering news that will change people's lives. He started with the basics, dates, addresses, legal language that made the whole thing sound like a contract instead of my father's last words. Diane nodded along at the formal parts, like she'd memorized them. The first few gifts were small. My dad left his tools to my cousin Brent, because he always liked tinkering, the will said, and a little cash to the local veterans fund he'd volunteered with for years. Someone behind me whispered, "That sounds like Richard," and for a second my chest tightened, because yes, it did. Then came the house. The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with grief. The property located at, Mr. Caldwell read the address, and I watched Diane's shoulders lift almost imperceptibly, like she was bracing for applause. She folded her hands tighter, composed, already stepping into the role she'd been performing all day. But the will didn't give it to her outright. It named her as the temporary administrator, for purposes of maintenance and immediate obligations. Not ownership. Not full control. Just a job. Diane's smile didn't drop, but her jaw clenched. She glanced around quickly, checking who noticed. A few people shifted in their chairs. Mr. Caldwell kept reading. My dad's bank accounts were to be used first for final expenses, then divided in certain ways that sounded careful. Diane received a portion, yes, but it wasn't the sweeping victory she'd implied in the chapel. It was measured. I could feel the mood in the room changing, not dramatically yet, but like a slow tilt. People who'd looked bored 5 minutes ago were now paying attention. Even Brent uncrossed his arms, his eyes narrowing at the paper like he could force it to say what he wanted. Diane interrupted with a soft laugh that didn't match her face. "That's fine," she said, waving a hand lightly. "Richard and I discussed most of this." Mr. Caldwell didn't react to her comment. He just continued, which somehow made Diane's little performance look smaller. The will mentioned personal items, my dad's watch, his old record player, the photo albums. Diane got some things. Brent got some things. A couple of distant relatives got token pieces, the kind that feel like an attempt to avoid future arguments. My dad even left a note about his dog, asking that the neighbor who always walked him keep doing it if possible, which made someone sniffle. Still, my name hadn't come up. I felt eyes on me, not as sharp as Diane's, but curious now. People were waiting. Diane sat back, her confidence rebuilding with each passing paragraph. The longer my name stayed absent, the more she seemed to relax, like the will was proving her point. Maya didn't matter here. Mr. Caldwell turned a page. The paper made a crisp sound in the quiet room. He adjusted his glasses and continued in the same calm tone. Then something small happened, so small most people didn't notice it, but I did. Diane stopped tapping her foot. It was like her body recognized a shift before her mind wanted to. Her eyes narrowed again, and she leaned forward slightly, watching the lawyer's hands, the pages, the tabs. She looked like someone suddenly realizing there might be a hidden room in a house she thought she knew. Mr. Caldwell read another clause, still nothing about me, but the language grew more specific. It described conditions. It described intentions. It sounded less like a standard document and more like my father speaking through legal terms. My dad wasn't flashy. He didn't do grand speeches. But he was stubborn in a quiet way. When he cared about something, he made sure it stayed done. He'd fix a broken hinge himself rather than ask for help, just to prove he could. He'd write notes on receipts and tuck them into drawers so nobody can say I didn't pay. Listening to the will, I realized he'd approached this the same way. Like he was fixing something that had been crooked for years. Diane tried another interruption, sharper this time. We understand, she said. If we could just. Mr. Caldwell looked up, polite but firm. I'll read it in full. The room went quiet again. Diane leaned back, lips pressed together. A couple of relatives avoided her gaze, suddenly uncomfortable with how hard she was trying to steer. I kept my face neutral, but my stomach felt tight. My fingers traced the edge of my cup without me noticing. Because even though I remembered the envelope my dad gave me, even though I remembered his warning, I still didn't know exactly what was coming. I just knew he'd planned something. Mr. Caldwell moved through the next portion slowly, like he understood the weight of every sentence. The air felt thicker. Every time he turned a page, it sounded too loud. And as he reached the end of what looked like the final section, Diane's expression turned almost satisfied again. She exhaled, long and quiet, like she'd been holding her breath and finally felt safe. Mr. Caldwell's hand hovered over the folder one more time. He paused. Not a dramatic pause, not the kind you see in movies. A real pause, the kind someone makes when they're about to enter the part of a conversation that will upset a room full of people. He slid out one more page, separate, clearly added after the rest, and his eyes lowered to it. Diane's head snapped up. And the whole room, without anyone saying a word, leaned forward together. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, not because he needed to, but because the room had gone so quiet it felt unnatural. He held the last page slightly apart from the rest, and that small gesture alone was enough to make everyone uneasy. Diane straightened in her chair, her confidence tightening into something rigid, like she was bracing for impact without admitting it. This final paragraph, he said, was added several months after the original document was completed. His voice stayed even, but the words carried weight. It was written at Mr. Collins' request and witnessed under the same legal standards as the rest of the will. Diane opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time all day, she looked unsure of the timing of her next move. Mr. Caldwell began to read, and the tone of the document changed immediately. It was still formal, still careful, but the language felt closer to my father's voice. He addressed misunderstandings directly, stating that distance should not be used as proof of neglect. He explained that not everyone who shows up loudly is acting out of care, and not everyone who stays quiet is absent by choice. I felt my chest tighten as the words settled into the room. My dad wrote about manipulation without naming it, about control disguised as responsibility. He made it clear that he was aware of how certain family members spoke about others in his absence. He acknowledged the stories told on his behalf and rejected them calmly, without anger, as if he'd had time to think through every sentence. Then came the part that shifted everything. He wrote that he expected one person, in particular, to remain silent during the process, not out of guilt, but out of restraint. He stated plainly that he trusted that silence more than public displays of concern. The room seemed to tilt. A few people glanced at me, then quickly looked away, like they didn't want to be caught realizing something too late. Diane's face drained of color. She shook her head slightly, almost to herself, as if refusing to accept what she was hearing. When Mr. Caldwell continued, explaining that the paragraph was included specifically to prevent misrepresentation of his wishes, Diane's composure cracked. Her foot started tapping again, fast this time, a nervous habit she couldn't control. The final lines explained that this paragraph was meant to restore balance. Not to punish, not to shame, but to correct the narrative before it became permanent. When Mr. Caldwell finished reading, he lowered the page slowly, like setting something fragile down. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than anything Diane had said earlier. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was charged. The kind of quiet where everyone knows something important just happened, and no one is sure how to react first. Diane was the first to break the silence, but her voice wasn't the one we'd heard all day. It was sharper, thinner, edged with panic she couldn't hide. "That doesn't make sense," she said quickly. Richard wasn't in his right mind near the end. He was confused. "You know that." Mr. Caldwell didn't flinch. "There is no medical record supporting that claim," he replied. And the document was reviewed and signed with full legal capacity. Diane stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is being taken out of context," she insisted, her eyes darting around the room, searching for support. "He relied on me. Everyone here knows that." But the room wasn't nodding anymore. Brent shifted uncomfortably. One of my aunts folded her arms, her mouth tight. Someone else whispered, "He sounds clear enough to me." The confidence Diane had worn like armor all day began to peel away, layer by layer, as people started replaying her earlier words in their heads. Mr. Caldwell continued, explaining how the final paragraph affected the distribution. It didn't erase Diane's share, but it limited her authority. Certain decisions required joint consent. Certain assets were protected from unilateral control. And one portion, clearly defined, carefully worded, was set aside for me. Diane laughed, but it came out wrong. "This is ridiculous," she said. She barely showed up. That's when I finally spoke. "I showed up when he asked me to," I said, calmly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "And when he didn't, I respected that too." Every head turned toward me. Diane stared like she couldn't believe I'd broken character. "I didn't need to announce it," I continued. "He knew. And apparently, he planned for this moment." Mr. Caldwell nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth without commenting on it. The facts were already doing the work. Diane tried once more, raising her voice, questioning the fairness, accusing people of misunderstanding her intentions. But it was too late. The room had shifted. People weren't listening to her anymore, they were watching her. Watching the way her story unraveled under pressure. What struck me most wasn't her anger. It was her fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being seen clearly. And in that moment, I understood something important. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about who got to define the story of my father's life. And he'd taken that power back himself. The meeting didn't end with shouting or dramatic exits. It ended the way real things often do, with exhaustion and silence. Mr. Caldwell closed his folder and explained the next steps in a practical tone, but most people weren't listening anymore. They were still processing what had just happened. Diane gathered her things slowly, avoiding everyone's eyes. No one stopped her. No one comforted her. She walked out the same door she'd once controlled, her heels clicking too loudly against the tile, and disappeared down the hall without looking back. A few relatives lingered, unsure of what to say to me. Some offered awkward apologies. Others just nodded, like they were admitting they'd been wrong without having to say it out loud. I didn't hold it against them. People believe the loudest voice until it stops making sense. When the room finally emptied, I stayed behind for a moment. I sat in the same chair I'd been in all afternoon and let the weight settle. There was no rush of victory, no satisfaction. Just a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. My dad had seen this coming. He'd handled it the only way he knew how, quietly, carefully, without cruelty. Outside, the air was colder now. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I stood there for a second, breathing it in, feeling grounded again. I hadn't fought. I hadn't begged. I hadn't humiliated anyone the way Diane tried to humiliate me. I just stayed still long enough for the truth to arrive on its own. And that was enough.